Here we go.
Yeah.
LinkedIn Live session. This is the Beyond Financial Services hype. Um, Last week there was an incredible conference, for 2 days. That Jonathan, I know you were a big part of it. The AI and Future of Finance at Georgia Tech. I know you got a lot of great key takeaways and themes that we're going to talk through. But the one thing I want to just say about you that we've just gotten to know each other, but I love the way that you take literally, hence the title for the LinkedIn Live session, is you take these very complex and these very important opportunities that are enabled by artificial intelligence and getting your data right and so on and so forth. And you're able to kind of help the audience understand, okay, this is what's real and what's happening right now versus this is what's a couple clicks away versus this is some really exciting stuff, but it's on the horizon. And I think the audience in particular is really going to be very fortunate to experience some of the conversations I have had previous to this and do this live. And so I want to give you an opportunity, Jonathan, as the financial services AI leader and head at Snowflake, to maybe introduce yourself, help us kind of open-ended question to jump things off here. What were you excited about? What was the experience like last week? And we've got 40 minutes, so we're going to find plenty of time to talk about your favorite major philosophy, as is mine. But yeah, by all means, I'm going to pass the microphone to you, Jonathan. You are up. Jonathan Regenstein.
Regenstein,
nailed it. Go ahead. It's all you.
All right. Thanks, Alec. Yeah, really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Really appreciate it. I'll introduce myself, and then we can kick it off talking about the conference a little bit, which I think is just going to open up so many cool avenues we can explore. So yeah, I'm our head of financial services, artificial intelligence and machine learning practice here at Snowflake, which has just been a really, really interesting role over the last couple of years. I get to kind of sit across a lot of our work in financial services. So asset managers, banks, insurance companies, what we call our ecosystem players, which is a lot of kind of data providers that are, really the connective tissue between all those. And I get to work on AI and machine learning with all of them. So I get kind of this lens across the whole landscape. And I also am a research affiliate at the Financial Services Innovation Lab at Georgia Tech, part of Scheller. And that was kind of how I came to be involved in the conference last week down at Georgia Tech, where relational was too. Got to meet a lot of the relational team, which was super interesting. And it was a 2-day conference, and we were really focused on exploring two things: what's actually happening in the world of AI. So that was like a big theme. Like we wanted to get away from the hype as much as we could. But then also, since it was an academic conference, we had a lot of students come in and present. And these are these super advanced PhD students at Georgia Tech. They really talked about the frontier of what could be coming, right? The research that they're doing now, which tends to be a year, 2 years ahead of what we're seeing in industry, right? And that was actually something I heard from a lot of the attendees, which was, man, we got to hear what's actually happening now, and then we got to hear from these crazy PhD students who are working on really cool stuff and what's going to be coming in 2 years. So the whole conference was awesome, I thought. I was really lucky. I got to participate in 2 ways. I got to present some pretty hardcore research that was all built on Snowflake that the S&P Global team put out, like finding pure alpha using artificial intelligence. Probably the best example of that research that I've seen. That's real, back-testable insights from text. I'll talk about, if you want later on, what I thought made that research so amazing for anyone who didn't get to fly into Atlanta for the conference. And then I got to host a panel with leaders from the buy side, the sell side, the fixed income risk side, and we just drilled in on what they're actually doing in practice. So the audience got to hear like what's actually happening. It was a really, really great conference. And then again, stitching a lot of that together, Nick from the relational team, he gave a really cool talk on GraphRag, and something we'll probably talk about more, which is what shape does your data need to be in to accomplish all this stuff, right? It was a key theme that emerged, kept emerging. People were talking about agents and models and model convert. Everyone, though, was coming back to data and having AI-ready data, which is something you and I talked about before. But, GraphRag is a huge part of that. So great conference. We're going to do it even bigger next year. I think people learned a lot. I learned a lot. So hopefully everyone else learned as much as I did in the conference. That's kind of what I've been working on. And we can take this conversation any way you want, Alec.
I love it. And there's
Yeah.
so many directions we can go. And I'm going to keep my eye on the clock because even though it's 40
Yeah.
minutes, based on the conversations we've had, I know we could go for a
Yeah,
lot longer.
we
So
can.
I'm going to kick things off here. Um, so a couple things. One
Mhm.
is I love the way you framed, the frontier stuff and then the stuff that's quote unquote happening, aka, real right now. And I think we all can appreciate that the pace of change, it's a different animal than any of us have frankly experienced as we're all stepping through this platform shift. And relational AI has a very special relationship, excuse the language and the connection there, to Snowflake as a Snowflake native application. And I think to kind of touch on that and open it up, I wonder if you could help us understand, the relationship between having AI ready data and therefore the things that you can do that are pretty extraordinary right now versus the things that those that don't have that situation sorted cannot do, and the competitive dynamic. You can pick any category or subvertical within finance, but I would love to
Sure.
hear that to kind of kick things off.
Yeah, 100%. I'll stick to maybe asset management for this one
Sure.
because I think it's the best place to go. And this idea of AI ready data, you can call it data modernization, you can call it a unified data strategy. It's kind of the differentiating factor that we see from our customers that are getting value out of AI right now and who are not getting value out of AI right now. And I think that elucidates a couple of key things. I mean, one, it's not about the model that you choose, right? And I
Right.
think that's a big shift we've seen over the last maybe 18 months, right? So, I mean, 18 months ago, when this whole world of LLMs just emerged into the public imagination, everyone wanted to talk about the next hot model. Have you tried this model? Have you tried that model? And it was really exciting. It was really, really hot. Everyone wanted to kind of dive into that. But now we're kind of seeing this model convergence, right? There's the delta that exists between LLMs is shrinking and shrinking. And frankly, they've been trained on everything that's ever been published on the internet ever at this point. They can keep training on synthetic data, of course. That's going to be a thing. But I mean, we're seeing model convergence, and there's this dawning recognition that it's all about your data strategy and your data estate that makes the big difference, right? So like, but then once we just talk about data, now it's like, well, it can't just be data. Like your data has to be ready for these models to be deployed upon it. And we talked about that, making your data AI ready. That's definitely the phrase we're talking about with people right now. And that takes us back to this world of unstructured data, right? Another, I think, vocabulary word that people didn't say that much, unstructured data. Now we talk about it in every conversation we had. It's like people's mental model around their data estate has completely changed, and the aperture's opened up to this world of unstructured data, like text and images. I mean, we were dealing with them before, but it was like a specialized niche thing where maybe you had a classically trained NLP engineer who could really dig into your unstructured data. Now, LLMs have opened up that world to basically everyone, but you have to have your unstructured data in shape to do that, right? So we think about unstructured data. We think about, well, who's been on this data modernization or getting their data AI ready? They didn't even know they were getting it AI ready. They were just modernizing their data, right? Ingesting their data. That made it possible for them to then start to think about, okay, we've kind of ingested, we've modernized our data. How do we get it AI ready? Well, a lot of that comes down to, like, frankly, I mean, it sounds so boring, but it's like chunking your data up in the right way, right? And then I talked about this with Nick from Relational, actually, like, well, once you've kind of started to chunk your data the right way, now you can start to think about, well, how do we put a knowledge graph on top of those chunks, right? He showed a really cool example of like chunking a 10K the right way and then putting a knowledge graph on top of it. And that fed in really well to the example that I actually showed from the world of LLMs, which was mining financial documents for insights that have been really hiding in plain sight, quite frankly.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So this was not like the two examples that we kind of showed, both Nick and I. It wasn't like data no one had ever seen before, and it wasn't even that. It wasn't even that we were asking LLMs to do something completely novel and crazy. It was that the data was in the right shape. And then we really were showcasing research that a team from S&P Global had done And these guys are deep domain experts in this world, right?
Yeah.
We have these deep domain experts. We have this data that's AI ready, and they came up with a really interesting hypothesis that LLMs allowed them to test, and LLMs allowed them to execute against, right? And that's really the power of AI, is when you have domain expertise and you have data that's ready to be interrogated with artificial intelligence. But now you can start to explore different hypotheses and really unlock insights that they've been there the whole time, right? They did something really cool with the question and answer section in earnings transcripts, right?
Yeah.
People have been analyzing this stuff for 20 years. They found pure alpha in these transcripts through a really interesting research project. It was like 6 months long. But it was running bottom to top in Snowflake, right? And then Nick showed, well, here's how a knowledge graph could make this even more powerful sitting on top of that, right? So you can just keep adding these different ways to make your data like more ready to be interrogated by these models, right? It's by far the differentiator that we're seeing across the world right now.
I love that you went there with the S&P bit as well, because we had chatted about that as well. So let me play something back to you and get you to react, to kind of double click. So I think what I'm understanding in part is that you could name the financial services institution, but it's a pretty good bet that they likely have a mountain of data, right? A mountain of data. And depending on the condition of that data, you might be able to see some of it, if not all of it, depending on how modern the data structure essentially is. And so if you get your data structure right, if you modernize that, then you introduce, big shout out to Relational AI, who's presented this. But if you introduce Relational AI, now you can take the data set, and then that you might not have been able to see all the different connections. And then you can see new connections, which are knowledge graph enabled connections. And you can then take those additional insights, which are incremental, and act off of them and achieve commercial value creation that in theory was not possible before. And if you try to do something like this 10 years ago, thanks to the condition of all the things that have now changed, it could take you up to 18 months to do something like this. Is that more or less accurate? And if so or not, please, correct me or go further on that a little bit.
I think that's accurate. And I'll tell you a really good example of that. So, I mean, like I said, in my role at Snowflake, I get to work with super sophisticated financial institutions. I mean, some of the most sophisticated hedge funds in the world, right? One of the projects that has come up repeatedly is this idea of the first thing we want to know is what data is available to us, right?
Yeah.
An analyst or a portfolio manager or a risk engineer logs into Snowflake or logs into whatever interface they have set up for their data estate. I mean, the first question, what data is available to me? I mean, because there is this notion amongst data scientists, machine learning people, quants, like more data is always better, right? So if a data vendor came to me when I was a quant researcher and I had an infinite budget, I would say, yeah, buy it, bring it on board, right? More data is better.
More better.
More is better. Then you end up with so much data that
what do I do with all this data? This is confusing.
How do I even keep track of it, right? I mean, the human brain is still somewhat limited. So the first step is figuring out what data is even available to me, right? And that sounds like it's not like a super sexy use case for AI, right? Just tell me what data is even in my catalog. But it turns out to be super important to anyone doing research, knowing what data is available to you. And then the second step of that is, okay, now I've got my head around what data is available to me. And I can, of course, use my brain and my domain expertise to know how these data sets are related to each other, or what potentially would be interesting data for this project. But then with something like a knowledge graph, now I can start to use AI to figure out, well, maybe there's some hidden relationships in here that I hadn't thought about before, right? But this is really all just prepping the data. I mean, we haven't even talked about large language models yet, and already the value creation is super, super high in this world right now. And that kind of takes me to a broader point in general, which is just thinking about this revolution in AI and large language models. I mean, oftentimes when we get kind of pushed back or maybe some skepticism, especially from quants, we'll kind of say well, what is the actual value of artificial intelligence? What's the value of LLMs, right? And I kind of say, well, there is no value of LLMs. The value is what's in the data, right? So there's value hiding in this data. There's insights hiding in there. The real question is, what's the value of those insights that you can unlock with LLMs, right? That's how you kind of measure the quote unquote ROI of an LLM or even an LLM powered application, right? Or the value of a knowledge graph like relational, right? So someone said, what's the value of a knowledge graph? Well, there's no inherent value. The value is that you're unlocking from the data, right? And when you just take that value that's unlocked and you have a domain expert, they can amplify the value of that, right? So you think about AI as like a force multiplier. Like the buzzword at the conference was certainly augmentation, right? How AI augments domain experts, right? But we're augmenting them with data, right? I mean, we're kind of augmenting them with AI, but really we're augmenting those domain experts with data. And I mean, I think that's what makes me really excited about this world we're getting to. And it took us about 18 months to get here, honestly. Like I said, the buzz was really around LLMs, and it's kind of this dawning recognition that actually it's the data. It's this world of unstructured data, these terabytes and terabytes of unstructured data that were impenetrable until the world of LLMs kind of came upon us. That was a big theme at the conference, actually, with this augmentation theme, which I thought was really interesting. That didn't used to be the theme, right? The theme used to be augmentation, yes, but really, honestly, like automation. That used to be, how are we going to replace people? That was a big theme maybe, again, a year ago, right? I was always kind of skeptical of that. In fact, I was very vocal in public in saying that I thought the winners in the world of AI were going to be those that were doubling or even tripling down on their technical talent, because if you get your AI strategy right, and that AI strategy is augmenting all your technical experts, and you've doubled down on your technical experts, it's going to be really hard for the competition to catch up to you, right? If they've been shedding workforce while you've been augmenting a growing workforce, in my opinion. Yeah, that takes us a little bit into the hype cycle that we've seen before, but we can circle back to that later. I don't want to get too far down.
No, you see me down here taking notes because you said three different things. I didn't want to interrupt you because you're doing a great job unpacking that. So here's the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we spoke about previously is like, yeah, skip all the drama with the POC, get right to finding a business problem where you can create commercial value and then get after it, right? So as a tee up to that, and you kind of know where I'm going with this, help the audience better understand, because I know you're very close to it. The difference between those financial services institutions that have been investing perhaps for a long time, and as I like the way you describe it, of like maybe they weren't even necessarily investing, anticipating what we now know to be reality. They just were doing the right thing by data, and they know that data is power and leverage and so on and so forth. But help us understand, what are the companies doing exceptionally well in terms of cross-functional collaboration, subject matter expertise that is or isn't technical, and bringing it all together to unleash this opportunity? Because I really do. The more I'm a nerd in this space. I've been in it for a long time. I think there's something in there, and I don't know how to describe it per se, but I bet you do a better job than I would. So without further delay on that one, I'm going to pass that right back to you. How do we get out of this POC drama and all that pilot stuff and get into just commercial value creation? Yep. And what does that team structure look like that really wins?
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love this question. So first, I mean, you started with the most important thing, right? Which is focus on commercial value, right? Yeah. And that has to be kind of the North Star of all of this. And again, I'll stick to kind of banking and asset management for now, because that's where we're seeing, I think a lot of commercial value. Almost all of our customers have created either an AI center of excellence or an AI kind of committee to kind of bless or not bless projects. Something we talked about actually explicitly in the conference, because we had 3 kind of AI leaders, and I asked each of them, how do you decide what project to bless? Because they're probably getting pitched project after project after project, and you want to say yes to all of them, but you can't, right? And you also don't want to end up with what I kind of analogize to like dashboard sprawl, right? Where you have like 1,000 dashboards and no one ever looks at them because you can't look at 1,000 dashboards in a single day. Same with AI applications, right? I mean, how many AI applications can you even use in a single day, even if they're all fantastic? And so it starts with the commercial value. Like, what is the commercial problem that we're solving here? So once we've kind of dialed in on that, let's say it's text analytics or let's say it's opening up access to internal or even external research that people just, they aren't reading, or they're not getting into the docs the way that we think they should be, and we think there's some value in them doing that. All right, so we've identified the commercial value. So now there's like 3 steps that I think people go through, and this, I think, is getting to your question. Well, then we go back to the very beginning and we say, well, what's the data that we need for this problem, right? Is it unstructured data, or is this already a solved problem? We just didn't know it. Well, let's assume that it's something to do with unstructured data, right? There's this massive corpus of unstructured data out there. To me, then the next question is, okay, we have our unstructured data. We know the problem we're trying to solve. Now we need to put the team together to go attack this. And I really think of it as involving a subject matter expert. So whoever defined that commercial value proposition, right? That person needs to stay intimately involved in this project from beginning to end. Then you need someone who knows that data estate, right? Because we just talked about the data. Could be a data architect, could be a data scientist, could be both, right? And then there's the technical expertise of deploying large language models, right? And it's not just the deploying of the models. It's probably going to involve taking that data, chunking that data up, which is not an exciting thing to talk about, but we at Snowflake do a ton of research into chunking, actually. We just put out a big piece on the importance of how you chunk your data, right? We got into contextual chunking, we got into linked chunking, all these different chunking strategies. Sounds crazy to even say it, right? But nowadays there are chunking strategies.
It's important.
It's important, right? And then you get into, okay, we kind of know how to chunk up this data. Then what models do we want to use to interrogate this data, right? So you got your chunking, you have your model selection, your prompt strategies. Prompting is really important to LLMs. We talked about this at length at the conference, actually, into there's an expertise that comes into prompting these models, right? And again, I think we're all, if you've really only interacted with these models in a chat interface, unbeknownst to you are prompting those models, right? That's kind of the prompt that you're doing. But for research, the prompts, make a really big difference between, good outputs and great outputs, and outputs that are going to solve that commercial problem and outputs that aren't going to. So if you just think about those 3 parameters also, right? So, well, I'll pause. That's kind of the team that I think you want to put together.
Yeah.
Right? The expertise in those main areas, right? But we just introduce a lot of complexity into that situation, if you think about it also, right? Because we talked about chunking, models, prompting, and commercial value.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to evaluate whether this project is going well or not going well, that's at least 4 parameters that you're evaluating across: chunking strategy, prompting strategy, model strategy, business strategy, right? So it's getting more and more complicated. You can see how these things start to compound on each other. And this is another thing we talked about at the conference, which is evaluating the success of these projects, right?
Right.
So it gets more and more complicated. The more you try to solve these problems, the more complicated it gets, I would say.
I agree. And I think historically, you could use a parallel, ish, to digital business transformation and 1.0. And I think that looks remarkably straightforward versus what we're dealing with now, because these, machines have effectively learned the human language, which, now enables us to use our native language to quote unquote replace coding in some respects, which is a wild thing to even say and think through. But one of the things you mentioned there, and I'm sure folks have, even those that are not technical, understand where you're going with the prompting and the prompt engineering in particular, as it relates to this massive brain, which is an LLM, and helping it better understand the contextual dimension of the question you're asking and what have you. But I wonder if we could go in a little bit further into RAG and therefore graph RAG, because I think they're kind of cousins. And I wonder if you might want to unpack a little bit of some of the interesting things that you heard, including big shout out to Nick the Greek from Relational AI, fantastic dude, about RAG, graph RAG, and maybe take some time to kind of deconstruct that for the audience, because I think sometimes people, I'm not suggesting any of you watching do this, but you kind of nod at stuff that you might not necessarily really understand. And I imagine, Jonathan, you can help them understand a little bit better than most. So please, definitely. I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. So just to level set for anyone who's not, been following the acronyms here for the last 18 months. So RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, meaning, LLMs have a corpus of data that they've been trained on. If you ask them a question, they can answer based on that corpus of data, right? But from an enterprise perspective, almost certainly the LLMs haven't seen your enterprise data, and definitely they're not up to date. So they haven't seen data from yesterday. So when you ask a question of an LLM, if you wanted to answer from an enterprise perspective, you first need to retrieve the data that's relevant to that question, and then you use that data to augment the answer that the LLM generates. So that's the RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. So just to kind of get everyone level set on what that phrase means. And that's by far the most common use case that's been implemented at the enterprise level that we've seen. Interestingly enough, I would say RAG is both the biggest source of, I would say, not the biggest source of not necessarily hype, but the biggest source of maybe implementations that aren't really delivering on value, but also the ones that are delivering on value.
No, that's fair. And I'm glad you call that out. We're not here to just like agree with everyone, right? Like, yes, keep going.
Yeah. So RAG, super common. It can be very valuable. It can also end up kind of a chat interface that that people don't use, right? Because it could be a chat, like we said before, to a bunch of data that maybe people aren't even looking to access, right? So you got to make sure you dial in on that. Very important to RAG, as we just kind of mentioned, is when you are retrieving the data to answer that question, it needs to be the right data. Right?
Yes.
So that's a huge differentiation point between a good RAG system and a bad RAG system. Because if you're retrieving the wrong data, you're actually leading people down the wrong path from the question that they've asked. So you're putting them in a worse situation than they would have been had they never had access to this RAG interface, right? And that's why graph RAG is so important, right? Because the key to a good RAG interface is retrieving the right data. And then the LLM is going to give you a beautiful, convincing answer to the question that you asked. That's almost a certainty at this point, right? So there are definitely very successful RAG implementations that don't need graph RAG. It could be that the data is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to index and kind of search against using standard, vector embedding and vector distance capabilities. There's definitely a whole class of applications for that. But for more complex, I guess, corpuses of data, when we really start to get into like deep enterprise stacks, that's where graph RAG makes a massive, massive difference, right? And Nick talked thoroughly about this in the conference. I encourage anyone to go either look at Nick's talk from the conference. I'm almost positive he's published some stuff in this area too. But what graph RAG does, right, is it's that kind of pre-step before you're querying the data, right? And it's unearthing these relationships so that when you're hunting for something that might be related to a question, you're taking advantage of these graph relationships, not just relationships in vector space. So it makes it much more likely that you're going to retrieve the right data to answer your question, right? And in fact, not only does that provide obviously better commercial value to the user of that RAG interface, but when I think about just trusting an LLM, which is a huge, huge area of focus this year for our customers, right? They've done a lot of experimentation, and now people are starting to ask, can I actually trust the outputs of these models, right? That's a very big hot topic. Surfacing the right data in a RAG interface, to me, is the most important parameter for establishing trust in a RAG interface, right? You have to trust the data that's coming. You can give full annotation back to where that data come from, so people can go check the primary sources. That's of course good, but even better is if you can just trust what's coming out of there at a very high level. So graph RAG is, to me, like the next iteration once we move on from what we can call, RAG 1.0, I guess, if you will. right? Where you're kind of building simpler RAG interfaces, you're surfacing the data. Now it's time for RAG 2.0, where maybe you want to ask much more complex questions that is really demanding that the back end of your RAG interface make connections between data that are not obvious and that may not be surfaced through like simple vector relationships, right? So I mean, I really think that says we're getting to like RAG 2.0 like graph RAG. Honestly, it's really, really important.
Yeah, so you nailed it. And I am not going to repeat anything you just said because you nailed it. But I do want to just make sure that the audience understands the implications of what you just framed. So let's just say, hypothetically speaking, you've got one entity that has their data right? They've got their data AI ready, it's modernized, and so on and so forth. Within the speed and the security and the environment of their Snowflake instance, they're now able to not only obviously have that situation sorted, but with relational AI in that environment, without any sort of movement of data that they're not comfortable with, you're now going to unlock the ability to see things that you've never seen before and act on them very fast,
right,
to create commercial value. That's essentially right.
That's it. Okay. Yeah, you nailed it. That's the time to value that's so powerful. And maybe I'll just take 30 seconds to explain.
Take as you got 9 minutes, my man. Go for it.
I just want to explain like how relational and Snowflake fit together, because it's an important piece of this puzzle, right? So when our customers are setting up their Snowflake environment, they obviously establish a very tight security architecture around that data, a very tight governance infrastructure around all of their data, their access. And then you have these incredible tools like relational AI out there that can kind of help you deploy a knowledge graph onto your data in Snowflake. What makes relational so cool is that it's what we call a native app that's available in the Snowflake marketplace. So when our customers want to deploy relational onto their Snowflake data, they actually pull relational down into their Snowflake instance, which means data is never leaving Snowflake. It's never leaving their security perimeter. And one of the things we talked about earlier was when you're scoping out any project at an enterprise level, but especially AI projects, right?
Here comes InfoSec.
First call is about business value. Second call is to InfoSec to see.
Otherwise, no more meetings.
Okay. If you can't satisfy InfoSec, this project is not moving forward. I'm telling you that right now. So that's the power of native apps, right? Is that you can pull this incredible technology down into your Snowflake instance. And like you said, time to value, you just like brought a graph database down into Snowflake that now you can use to power your different RAG applications, right? So very fast, but you don't get speed to the enterprise level without security and governance. Again, the stuff that's not like fun and sexy to talk about, but you have to have it or none of this stuff is going to go anywhere, right? So that's kind of that's just the machinery around Snowflake and relational and how it works, right? So I just wanted to drill into that for a second, because not everyone kind of knows what a native app is on Snowflake in our marketplace, right? But that's how it works, right? You're bringing these models, you're bringing this app to your data in Snowflake.
Well, so shout out to Relational AI founder and CEO Moham Aref, who helped me understand this, and you confirmed it, yesterday when we were talking, right? This Snowflake being the iPhone of data infrastructure is such an elegant way for anyone that's listening to understand exactly what you just said, because that's where we're going, right? Is you want the elegant, the simple, the fast, the secure, which that's a great kind of way to describe Snowflake, I would imagine.
Yeah, it really is. I love that analogy that Moham came up with. I mean, it's.
Oh, I don't know. He came up with it. I want to be sure.
My citations.
We're
gonna go with
I heard it from him. I heard it from him. It's all I'm gonna say. I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah, the idea is we have this very robust marketplace out there, the Snowflake marketplace, that started as a data marketplace, just a place for orgs to share data, which of course in financial services that's their lifeblood, right? That's how they do things. So to be able to get data from different data providers across our marketplace and pull it into your Snowflake environment, that was an absolute differentiator. Now it's becoming a place where applications can be deployed, those native apps we just talked about. So relational is a great example of that. I'd say more broadly though, we are conceiving of it as almost like the App Store, right? Because you have your data gravity in Snowflake, you have your data security, your architecture set up. Now you can pull these different apps in. to me, in the world of artificial intelligence, it's hugely important because, and our CEO has been very, very vocal about this. This world is going to change a lot over the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, right?
Yes.
I don't think anyone really knows where it's going, but we know it's going to change a lot. You want your data to be AI ready, and with something like the Snowflake marketplace, where you can pull apps in, as places innovate, as more places like relational AI innovate in this world, you can pull those apps down into your data, and you can start to use multiple apps at the same time, right? Like I think you guys have done stuff with other app providers that are out there, different ways you can kind of mix and match and maybe put different AI applications on top of a graph. That's all going to happen on Snowflake. Our strategy has been to be that platform, that clean, elegant data platform where these different applications can be deployed. Again, that was not a super popular way of looking at the world 12 months ago.
Isn't that crazy how fast things have changed? Because
really
yes.
changed a lot. Yeah, I feel like DeepSeek kind of made everyone realize, oh my God, like there's going to be a lot of LLMs out there, and the key is going to be where you deploy them and how you deploy them and how ready your data is to kind of, again, be interrogated by these models and be analyzed by these models. Yeah, it took that moment, which was a crazy thing, but now here we are,
Yeah, we are, and you're touching on a conversation, which is definitely why I said in the front end of this we could talk for way more than 40 minutes. But you are touching on the conversation that is starting to happen in lots of places about the transition from an application-centric architecture to a data-centric architecture to a knowledge. We can go on and on. But before we go there, because we'll do that another time, and I hope we can make another one of these happen, soon. I do want to ask about the JP Morgan infusion and all that awesome stuff that I want to give them the credit that they deserve for how long they've been, investing in modernizing their data and anticipating what now it seems very clear to everyone. But I know they've been at it for a while. So I wonder if you want to take any time, speaking a little bit to all the great things that they've done, because I know there's some cool stuff.
It's a great example. JP Morgan Fusion, they talked about it at our summit last year. It's a phenomenal example of using AI to unlock data in a very seamless way, right?
Yeah.
It really is that kind of chat with your data, almost holy grail we've been looking for a long time, where you can ask questions of very complex portfolio data. Under the hood, there's really powerful artificial intelligence. We call it Cortex here at Snowflake. So Cortex is kind of running under the hood to unlock a lot of those insights. But I always like to point out, and you can kind of go back and look at this over the years, JP Morgan started working on AI 10 years ago. And they've been kind of preparing for this moment. So I like to say they're an overnight success in AI that's been working on it for 10 years, right? And they've been doing research on this. They've been getting their data ready. Again, I don't know if they were anticipating this large language model moment, but it's all kind of paying off now, right? So Fusion is a really just great example of when your data is ready, and you're kind of open to exploring these different possibilities around AI, and they've been putting Cortex into a lot of the machinery in there. So Cortex is Snowflake's AI stack, where we kind of onboard large language models into our ecosystem. It's just unlocking tons of insights across the board right now. So super innovative way, and also a very seamless way to put AI into your products. And I think that's going to be something too. It's going to be very seamless, right? People are not going to, I think, know they're using AI for a lot of the things that they're using it for.
It fades in the background, right? Like electricity, like these lights. I don't think about my electricity strategy per se. But I also appreciate that JP Morgan really puts themselves out there in terms of case studies and what they're working on and some of the research and whatnot, because that's not as frequent in the financial services space. And I understand why, but it is great. With a minute and a half left, Jonathan, I want to give you the moment to wrap things. And I told you that we could go, on and on and on here. So we got 90 seconds, 60 seconds. They're telling me now. So you got 60 seconds. Anything else you want to, wrap up with?
So one thing I'll say we haven't covered yet, and this came up in my panel from a panelist from JP Morgan, John Neubauer, who runs their structured equity derivatives practice there, is, there's this notion of the fear of missing out for an artificial intelligence. And John talked about the opposite of that, which is the risk of missing out on artificial intelligence, right? And it's a great way. It's, of course, how someone who works in equity derivatives would think about the world risk. And I do think that's where we've gotten with AI. So when you hear people who are skeptical, who are talking about AI, is it really going to be what you think? Just remember, there's fear of missing out, but there's also a high risk of missing out on this movement, right? And that will come if your data is not ready to take advantage of AI. No matter where this world heads, the risk of missing out is very, very high on this. So
Guaranteed.
Yep.
Guaranteed. Facts. Yep. I think they're wrapping it up on us. So, Jonathan, thank you so much. We're going to do this again soon, I hope, because this is awesome.
Let's do it again. Thank you, Alec. Thank you to the relational team. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Take care. Likewise, everybody. See ya. All right.